Okay, well, with that, let us go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Happy early DC springtime. My name is Luke Nathan Phillips. I am the Publius Fellow for Public Discourse at Braver Angels, and I am eager and pleased to welcome you all to the first of the America's Public Forum events we are doing here in DC for the spring of 2023. Expect many more to happen over the springtime and into the summer and fall. Quite a few I hope to happen here at the Hammond restaurant, one of my favorite little spots in DC. We are joined today by two very interesting and eloquent thinkers on the subjects of conservative economic thinking and conservative economic policy, among other things. But before we get to the conversation, let me just introduce a few things. So Braver Angels, for those of you who have not heard of it, is the country's largest fully red-blue grassroots-led organization committed to working to help Americans across every political, cultural, and social divide find value in each other despite and sometimes even because of their differences. We do not do bipartisan stuff for its own sake. We do not do moderation stuff for its own sake, although we do some of those. The main thing that we do is what you might consider to be a kind of marriage counseling or family therapy applied to the politically estranged. And all of you who have relatives who disagree with you, who you see every Thanksgiving, I know you have various reasons to understand that intuitively. So what does Braver Angels do in DC? We do a couple things, but my personal role in that is figuring out ways to work with engaging the community of policy intellectuals and policy professionals on their own terms. And sometimes that's meant doing workshop and training programs, but more often that's meant doing panel and debate events like the one that you're about to be in here. So the Braver Angels DC project is the colloquial term for the speaker and debate events working to think through various questions of interest, not only to Braver Angels, not only people who work in depolarization, but in our view, to anybody who has intellectual and theoretical and philosophical questions on the nature of America's ideological divides, partisan divides, identity divides, and everything in between. And given that Braver Angels has a no lines drawn policy, and we will talk to anybody and work with anybody who is willing to do the work, no matter what their ideological beliefs might be, we have a unique opportunity to do that across the spectrum in fun ways. This is just one of the fun ways tonight, but we'll be doing more and more of those in the coming weeks and months. So with that, welcome to the first of the America's Public Forums, and this one will also be a kind of introduction to a theme that I'd like to explore in future America's Public Forums, the question of how to think about political economy and the social vision question in the different policy agendas and the different ideological arrangements and the different political coalitions that arise in American politics every so frequently and are constantly shaping and shifting before our eyes right now. A lot of us in this room work in those too, so I will look forward to getting to the Q&A as well and hearing some more on that. Two quick logistical notes. You'll note that we are not using microphones. That's because this space is good audio enough that I think we should be able to get through this. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes. Cool. So sound, Chris, if we all just do our best to talk with our outside voices in here, I think we should be good. Second off, this is being recorded with the OWL camera system, which my colleague and friend Randy Leoz nabbed for Braver Angels once in a while ago. The OWL camera system will be focusing mainly on the speakers, but it has some kind of algorithmic governance thing that causes it to look around the room. And so if you rise and ask a question, it will probably catch you on its camera as well too. Just not right. It's not right. Well, we can have a Braver Angels debate hosted by American Compass on the ethics of technocratic governance. What else? Oh, our two servers here are two former co-workers of mine, Sergio and Diego. Sergio and Diego, wave real quick. Thank you guys for being here, and it's good to see you guys in a very different work context than one of the last times I saw you. So, but thank you for helping us here tonight. Okay, so anything else I should be thinking on? Nope, that's about all. So without further ado, let me introduce our two guests and then introduce the topic. So we are joined tonight by Chris Griswold, who is the policy director at American Compass, which is a think tank on Capitol Hill that has been doing some fascinating work and fascinating advisory with various members of Congress on the questions. Correct me if this is an inaccurate way to characterize it, but questions of what a working class conservatism would look like on various realms of policy, on everything from economic to family to social policy. Is that more or less right?
Mainly economic policy.
Economic policy. So Chris is policy director for American Compass, and we're very pleased to have you here. Thank you for being here with us, Chris. Please clap. And we are also joined by Sam Hammond of the Niskanen Center. Sam is the social policy director over at the Niskanen Center, and the Niskanen Center has been a think tank in the last several years has been working on thinking through various, on the one hand, state capacity libertarian associated solutions, and on the other hand, what some of its members, I believe, have called libertarian solutions to various policy issues, ranging from questions of income and wages to questions of climate policy and immigration and the whole gamut. And Sam has been heading up a lot of their social policy work, particularly in questions of economic and family policy questions as well. Is that more or less accurate? Yeah. Well, we are very pleased to be joined by Sam Hammond. Please clap. I will just note that neither of them said please clap. It was me who said please clap. So if anybody has anything to say about that, it's about me. So yeah. Okay. With that, those who follow the world of memes have probably by this point seen a meme called the political compass. And the political compass meme posits that there's not just a spectrum of left-right, but there's multiple spectrums overlaid over each other. And that the different attitudes towards various policy questions and various understandings of economics are best seen not merely left-right, but over a whole political compass. And that's for multiple reasons, one of which is that there's no single issue area that defines anybody's political ideology. And given that America is in a lot of ways not just a two-party system, not even just a 5 or 6 party system pretending to be a two-party system, but a real diverse and pluralistic and fundamentally creative semi-Madisonian hodgepodge of new arrangements and new theories of politics becoming temporary majorities and then ceasing to be majorities. Given that that's what America in ideological politics tends to be at times, I thought that it would be good to dedicate the first couple of America's Public Forums this year to doing a kind of swing around the political compass. And so Sam and Chris, and this is my words, not theirs, represent, in my personal view, different parts of what you might think of as the communitarian right quadrant of the American political compass. And the communitarian right tends to lean traditionalist and conservative on various social issues, while being far more open to public government interventions in economic and structural life. And so under that understanding, the questions of what the future of conservatism as it relates to family policy, as it relates to economic policy, as it relates to how should the next Republican presidential administration think about economics, or how should the next Republican Congress working with the Democratic administration think about economics. Those are questions that I think Sam and Chris are uniquely well positioned to help us think through, and I just have a couple questions for them myself too, because I don't actually know their opinions on some of these things, so I'm excited to explore them in good faith with them here. So, but let me open up a preliminary question for each of you, and you can respond however you like in turn. What has the connection between conservative social thinking and the conservative vision of the good society been to conservative economic policy making and the conservative vision of how economics should be construed. What has that relationship been in your times in Washington so far? And what are some of the most interesting surprises you might have noticed about changes in that in the last few years? And what are some things that you yourself might hope for that relationship of economics to society? How would you like to see that change by the ends of your lifetimes? And either of you can go first.
Sure. Chris, happy. Yeah, well, thanks for having us. I came to DC at the beginning of 2015, which is when John Boehner was still Speaker of the House, and then shortly after I got here, Paul Ryan became the Speaker of the House. And it's kind of the height of what I guess I'll call it Paul Ryanism, of this long-standing fusion, as people call it, between kind of Cold War hawks, social conservatives, and economic libertarians, in which economic policy was largely outsourced to libertarians. And then you could kind of keep evangelicals and social conservatives over here on the side, and they get their issues, and big business is happy, and that's the deal. And then, a few years after I came to DC, I was still working in the House of Representatives. Everything changes in 2016. So you've got this Paul Ryanistic kind of what I'll call free market fundamentalism, program of unfettered free trade, tax cuts upon tax cuts, entitlement reform and budget cuts, as kind of the go-to solutions for every problem, and maybe add deregulation on that list. Rinse and repeat. And that's what Republicans have been doing for quite a long time. Turns out, wasn't working very well for a whole bunch of working class Americans. And so then you get 2016, Donald Trump shows up and challenges a lot of these economic orthodoxies in his campaign and shatters the right wide open. I mean, if you remember the way he ran in 2016, it was, let's nail the hedge fund bastards and make them pay their fair share. That's like Bernie Sanders language. It was never ever touch Medicare and Social Security, which is now Republican orthodoxy. It sure wasn't that. I mean, Paul Ryan's whole thing was entitlement reform, right? It was maybe this free trade regime hasn't worked out so well for working people, which is true. And he wins, and that fractures the whole right of center wide open. And I think, in my view, the right hasn't yet really put the pieces back together. Trump himself didn't do that. His administration was fairly fractured itself and often kind of incoherent in its governing style. There's a lot of cabinet members with totally different views of the world, totally different economic theories that didn't all agree with each other. And then obviously by 2020, President Trump loses the election, and it becomes largely about himself, the personality. And so the question, I think, for the right of center is like, what now? What now? And the right hasn't answered that question yet. And so you ask, and you see it in 2022, the kind of very underwhelming performance of, quite frankly, like a winnable race, failing to retake the Senate, barely retaking the House instead of dominating as was expected. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But one of those reasons, I think, is the failure of the institutional Republican Party to redefine what it is for economically. Can't quite, everyone's not on board, top to bottom with Paul Ryanism anymore. But they haven't reconstituted themselves yet. And until they do, I think that there's going to be challenges, at least politically, for the institutional Republican Party. So you asked it, what would we like to see? I would like to see, and this is what we do at American Compass, and we could talk more about this, is a right of center that figures out that there is still a multi-ethnic working class majority out there. Whoever wants to come and get them can get them. The Democrats have their own challenges for why it's hard for them to fully close that deal. There's just this massive opportunity staring both parties right in the face, and whoever gets there first is going to win a lot. And to do that on the right, I think the right will need to ditch kind of firmly and once and for all these old economic orthodoxies that the market always knows best. And focus on what the dignity of working people and the well-being of their families and the centrality of like local thriving communities, which the industrialization totally gutted all across the country. The focus on national industry and kind of muscular industrial policy. Do that, and I think working people will, number one, be better off, and the right will have kind of found a new way to contribute. And that's where we are. Stop there for now.
I will have some further follow-up questions on there. But first off, Sam, same question to you. What's changed in the time that you've been here and what was most interesting?
It's interesting. I also came to DC in 2015, being more or less a Ron Paul libertarian type, which is a strange thing for a Canadian, but I want the country, myself, to get back to this constitution. And similarly, it was this, it was still not quite the high water mark, but within, a stone's throw of the Tea Party wave, when, Rand Paul was on Time magazine and everything else. And one of the things, to piggybacking off of what Chris mentioned is the Trump election and the fact that he won, totally blew open this paradigm that this is the new constitutional moment. We're all libertarians now. I think it was Thomas Massey who said, in retrospect, they weren't voting for him because he was the most strict constitutionalist. They were voting for the craziest motherfucker in the room. I think something to that effect. And there's definitely a lot of truth to that. And what they're really voting for was, in some ways, anti-system rather than rather than for libertarian utopia. They're just voting for someone who would blow up the system. And this made me think, start to reconsider my own libertarian priors. A good example of, I think, the mistake that I and other libertarians make or still make was exemplified by a comment David Bowes made at the Cato Institute's 40th anniversary. So the Cato Institute, biggest libertarian organization, David Bowes is its president, and they recorded they had a panel sort of like this, and one of the questions was, if you could wave a magic wand, what is the one law that you would get rid of? And Bowes said, payroll tax withholding. On the theory that if it's easy to pay your taxes, if your employer collects it and remits it for you, then taxes can be higher and you don't notice that the government is standing on your neck or whatever. To me, this is just a totally bonkers sort of conclusion. Obviously, 50 different laws you would probably repeal if you had a magic wand. But more than anything, it exemplified this idea that the way we get to libertopia is by making government shittier, and making the experience of going to the DMV like super awful, and so then people will lose trust in government and therefore vote for smaller government. But what actually happens is people lose trust in the establishment and vote for authoritarians who will promise to come in and make sure the DMV is efficient and make sure taxes are collected and so on and so forth. So that was the first thing, that this strategically, this wasn't a working strategy, because what it actually gave rise to was sort of the antithesis of a libertarian. The second thing was, so a deeper point from here is that if you look historically at the development of like capitalist institutions in the West, it wasn't because we had a weak state. In fact, it was because we had a very strong state, very strong centralized governments that could enforce property rights, could enforce contract law. This is actually something that's extremely difficult. It's not a spontaneous order. Weak states are like Vietnam or something like that. Like weak states, not today, but like when they were in civil war. Weak states are like northern Mexico, like where the narcos run the show. Like that's what you get when you weaken a state. If you want strong property rights, you want strong contract, you actually want strong government. You might want limited government, but the government itself has to be strong. And similarly, one of the emerging themes, I think, over the last 5 years has been this discourse around state capacity. That regardless of, we can debate like on a moral dimension what government should do, but whether or not we resolve the debate, once we've decided what government should do, it should at least do it well. right? And so if we have a pandemic, we should have something like Operation Warp Speed that, you know, underwrites millions and millions of vaccines so we can actually get out of the pandemic and get our freedom back. That is a lesson that is only starting to be learned. Because, you know, for all of my optimism that there could be like this grand realignment, I still, you know, I would disagree with Chris that like cutting Medicare and Social Security as being like that being a new Republican orthodoxy not to do that is just not, at least not yet. You know, maybe eventually, but you know, right now we're having a debt ceiling debate that's rooted in, I think, the exact same fallacy of making government less functional will result in better outcomes. And maybe we need to even slash these super popular entitlement programs because we care about government as a percentage of GDP rather than deeper issues. And so when it comes to, you know, family policy and these other issue areas, the reason that I'm ultimately for a kind of deep polarization agenda is not because I'm kind of squishy moderate. It's because I want to see. It's not that I want to see. I think America needs broad-based structural reform across many different verticals in our society. Whether it's just today, like there's a massive data breach of DC Health Link where all the members of Congress and their staff have their personal medical information being swept up by some hackers. You know, like a few years ago there was the OMB hack that had like 50 million different records. We're entering an era where we're going to need state capacity for our own survival because we're going to be under constant cyber attacks both at home and abroad. There's obviously a war in Europe right now. We have energy needs and infrastructure needs that aren't being met because yes, we can pass $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill, which is in some sense a surprise. But on the other hand, we built the entire interstate highway system for $500 billion in today's dollars. And so the fact that, spending double that amount to like build some potholes and fix some bridges is a testament to just how we've actually regressed in our ability to build things. So across all these different domains, family policy is another one. If you take a country like South Korea, which is probably furthest along in these trends, their fertility rate right now is something like 0.7 per woman. Replacement's 2.1. What that means is in a century from now, 100 Koreans will go down to 4. So their population, China's population, China's fertility is a bit higher, but their population still will have in the next 45, 50 years. So this is more than just like strong families. Strong families are great, but we also just need people. And this is going to call for a lot more than sort of like tinkering on the margin. I've contributed my own like work on the child tax credit, but it's going to be something that requires a lot of different forms in a lot of different areas. And that can only be done if you have a relatively high degree of consensus in Congress. So that's ultimately why I want to depolarize and I'm trying to build sort of the intellectual center that, maybe American Compass is to my conservative right, and there are people like in the supply side, progressive Ezra Klein kind of world who are to my left. But this is sort of a new paradigm that's emerging that if it can build enough of a vanguard, especially in Congress, then we can get to the 60 votes needed in the Senate and the majorities that you need to actually reset our machinery of government.
Just as a full clarification, Brave Angels will support you guys, but we will also support your rivals in the other 40 votes too. In our vote.
Yeah.
So,
well, if you think about it, like when we talk about like what moderation was in yesteryear, like moderates brought China into WTO, moderates waged war in Iraq, moderates, built the European Union. Like these are all like radical, almost utopian projects. And I'm not saying we need more of that, but we need a Washington consensus, not the Washington consensus, but a Washington consensus to respond to the 21st century.
So I have many questions for both of you on how consensuses are built across different ideological lines. But before I get to them, I think if I'm hearing things right, Sam, you have an understanding of how the policy consensus changes and of how government is operated that seems to flow in some sense from the top down, from the policy worlds, entrepreneurs and thinkers and intellectuals and the networks of them who staff the institutions of power in DC, from the administrative agencies to Capitol Hill staffer groups, to the think tanks, to the consultancies and lobbyists and all that sort of thing. And that in general, there's a part of what's driven you in the way that you think about these things is how folks at that level think about things, which can be in line with public opinion or can be out of line with public opinion, but that class's understanding of things is the one that you're worried about. And it sounds to me as well that Chris, the basis of most of your understandings of this comes from the reverse direction, from the bottom up, a question of what do voters who don't actually know anything about what happens in DC, but do have a very particular understanding of how what happens in DC affects them. It sounds to me like your understanding of what the value of changes in policy would be focuses more on what you might call the public opinion side of it, what you might call the electoral majority side of it, but is a question of thinking about what a new majority from the bottom up looks like. Is that an accurate way of framing how you use?
I would say it's both, at least in my view. I mean, because of course change has to be enacted by decision makers. I think the question is, are decision makers listening to the public or not? And the Washington consensus that Sam was referring to that kind of got us into a lot of this mess has been, I think, unresponsive to what the public has actually been saying for a really long time. So it's bottom up and top down in like a healthy kind of ecosystem sense, where the question in my mind is like, is DC listening to working America? And the answer is, I think, pretty clearly no, because if it was, number one, we would be closer to consensus on some really important issues, and two, the policy preferences of policymakers would be notably different. I'll give you some examples. The American public, on the one hand, working people seem pretty clearly to want forms of collective representation, collective voice and power in the workplace. They want that. They want to be able to speak. They feel on the whole like they don't have as much influence at work as they would like, not just on wages and benefits, but respect in the workplace, how new technologies are adopted, and so on. They want that. All the data is very clear on that. They also hate unions' involvement in partisan politics. It's the number one reason why even people who might otherwise be interested, find themselves ambivalent about current labor unions as currently constituted. All right, so which party is going to give them that? Like strong collective representation at work that is not involved in partisan politics? There is no party offering them that right now, because neither party is listening to that desire. Similarly on family policy, which I know is quite close to Sam's heart, I think at least some of the research we've done seems to indicate working Americans, including working class conservatives, want a generous family benefit that's distributed monthly, that is more generous than tax liability, which has been a red line for a lot of Republicans. But that also has at least some kind of modest connection to work. That's also something that challenges orthodoxies on both kind of party structures as they exist right now. So I don't know if it's so much as like, is it top down or is it bottom up? It's, are the decision makers listening or not? And if they don't listen for long enough, the public's probably going to change them. I remember talking to a guy who worked on Bernie's 2016 campaign, and he was trying to explain like the phenomenon of Bernie primary voters, Trump general voters, which is a big population. And his explanation to me was, Chris, these voters did not want to ratify their continued devaluation, and they thought that Hillary Clinton represented the economic status quo. And so the Democratic primary, they voted for Bernie, and in the general, they voted for Trump, simply because they wanted something else. To Sam's earlier point, like almost didn't even really care who, but they refused to ratify their own continued devaluation. So I think that's on the electoral side, that's the kind of the gauntlet is thrown, I think, to DC and to elected officials. Listen, or we'll swap you out for someone who at least will pretend to listen. So I don't know, that's how I would describe it.
Sam, what do you think on that too?
Um,
And I was not attempting to paint you as populist and you as an elitist, just so it's clear.
I mean, for better or worse, public policy is overwhelmingly driven by a very relatively narrow and rarefied elite in this country. And really any country is just sort of like classic, like Pareto law, you know, there is a kind of mythos in America that change comes through sort of civil rights movement style pushes where you have a million-man march, and that will happen occasionally. But then you see it being replicated where like people want climate action, so they're trying to make this like a new civil rights movement. And what actually happens, the way laws actually get passed empirically, and political scientists look at this, it's like virtually every law is through relatively small governing networks of policymakers. And it's not that I want it to be that way. That's just the way it is. You know, there was maybe a more halcyon days like pre, 1960s where like there were mass membership parties and large labor federations, and they had more of a voice. And I think actually that's one of the root causes of our loss of like legitimacy is politics has become kind of disintermediated, and decisions are being made on the basis of public opinion polling rather than actual bottom-up demand. But ultimately, what gets passed and what gets into bills on the Hill, occasionally it will be because you have a bunch of Zoomers in your office with crocodile tears, but mostly not. Mostly is because you have folks like Chris or other policy entrepreneurs who are like, I first met Chris working on Marco Rubio's small business administration reform. And this was, I think, a good example of sort of realignment thinking. Rubio was the chair of the small business committee at the time. And the idea was let's bring the small business administration back to its roots with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is like a pretty mind-blowing thing for any Republican to propose. But the idea is, but the SBA has all this authority to like give loans and so forth. Let's use that to target manufacturing and other sort of critical industries. That wasn't because he had a big bottom-up demand from Miami-Dade or something like that. It was because he had a vision, an idea, and then ultimately in a smaller Republican system of government, you need representatives that are doing more than just maxing for their narrow constituencies and trying to reinstate the salt deduction and stuff, or whatever it is. Like in moments like today, like we really need statesmen and women who have the ability to translate sort of populist undercurrents into a active, coherent program. Yeah. Right. Because I don't think populism is at the most is a kind of like check engine light, right? It's not giving you the solutions, it's telling you something is wrong. And the sad fact is that we're having a legitimacy crisis, and it's an earned legitimacy crisis. Like, it's not that elites are bad per se, but we have the wrong elites. And we're not going to get to a world of like direct democracy, but we could potentially get a better elite. And that is a story of basically one funeral at a time.
I think Sam is right. I mean, as per usual, Sam is much more sophisticated.
We're not endorsing anybody specifically, Guy. Just
No, as usual, Sam is more sophisticated in his articulation of these things. So I think he's right. Like I probably err if I over describe the like theory of change in purely electoral terms, because of course he's right. Which is just to say that leadership does matter. He's right about that. Where when I say, is DC listening to the public, that's not just in electoral terms, it's in these bigger picture terms. Like if you ask Rubio, why did you start thinking along those lines, and the need for a more aggressive industrial policy, or kind of a developmentalist understanding of what we need to do domestically? It was his experience running in 2016. They said that publicly many times, that he runs in 2016, he gets beat, and he realizes as he's traveling the country that something is outdated about the conservative economic consensus. And something needs to be done about it. So that's not Miami-Dade constituents knocking on the door saying, why haven't you, reformed the SBA? That's someone kind of, as you described, seeing the currents, the big picture currents of recognizing something needs to be done about it. Which is just to say,
I'm hearing a couple different things on the nature of what the new majorities would look like, and I think Sam, your argument of American Compass being something like a rightward version, and Matt Iglesias and some folks in the state capacity left being a kind of liberal version. You have a kind of transpartisan approach to it, it sounds, and that's not to say, Chris, that yours is not transpartisan, but it sounds like yours focuses more on making alterations among Republicans on things, along things. But my question on this is that, as you might know, there's a significant contingent. I don't know if it's a majority or a minority or a plurality or whatever, but there's a significant contingent of peers of ours in conservative policy world who are very much not on the same train that either of you two are suggesting right now. And so my question is kind of twofold, I guess. Number one, what do you see as the future for folks like, for example, folks from the Canadians, folks from certain former versions of the American Enterprise Institute and the Heritage Foundation, not specifically, but like generally people who still hold on for various reasons, many of them good, to a certain idea of the old free market and fiscal austerity thing. Where do you see them and their role in any of these new coalitions or any of these new consensuses that you're thinking of? And what do you think? Is there any value to their sticking to their guns on those things as we move forward?
Yeah, I'm Canadian, and like I mentioned, and the job, independent policy analysis in a think tank, that's not a job in Canada, right? Because we have parties that like build their own platform, and if they need outside help, they go get it, but they don't have like, outside of a few PO boxes and so forth. So like the nonprofit industrial complex is a very uniquely American phenomenon. And I think it's also one of the reasons why change has come so slowly, right? So, there are similar like demographic realignments taking place across really the entire Western world where, the trends in education polarization and working class voters moving right. It's seen in Australia, it's seen in Canada and the United Kingdom and across Europe. We had a conservative party leader, Aaron O'Toole. He wasn't successful, but his platform called for bringing co-determination to Canada's biggest companies, like the kind of Elizabeth Warren plan, right? Like, and Boris Johnson, bless his heart, like his idea was like, let's develop the green belt and do like big science. And they were like, because they have different systems of government, they were able to respond to the shifting coalitions in their parties in a way that the American system doesn't allow. Because even though these exact same trends are occurring here, policy is being developed out of sort of incumbent institutions that have massive endowments often and rigid ideological scripts that were developed, in the 80s, right? And so that makes the change a little bit slower. And where we've been, so part of this isn't going to come out of the old think tanks. I think the old think tanks will eventually catch up. And I think one of the more notable things was Kevin Roberts at Heritage writing a piece about, maybe we should cut the defense budget here or there, right? Like that was, for Heritage, that was a big deal, right? But it's going to have to come from new institutions. It's going to have to come from places like American Compass or Niskanen or other places that are relatively younger, that don't have all that baggage and are able to like sort of leap to the new equilibrium in a way that the older institutions can't.
I think it just add like that is a challenge on both the right and the left, right? So I think it merits being said, if I'm talking about this kind of populist backlash against a failed economic theory that the Washington consensus has pursued for 40 years. The left is also well aware of that and is trying to do something about it. I think President Biden personally probably gets that a lot better than a lot of other people who kind of populate the institutional professional infrastructure in DC. I mean, in State of the Union, if I recall, he mentioned abortion once. It was all blue collar jobs that don't require a college degree. So the challenge, I think, on the left is partly what Sam described, is that there's an institutional kind of culture of professionals who have their own set of priorities that run up against, I think, the correct instincts of someone like the president. And they're going to have to figure that out. And I think on the right, you've got a different set of problems, but they're analogous, where I think a growing realization, say, for example, you mentioned, you know, all right, well, what about the traditional free market guys? I think there's like an intellectual case to be made that free markets require certain kinds of policy parameters and constraints to stay free. Otherwise, they stop working. If you offshore all of your productive capacity to China because that's what was most efficient to do, and then it turns out you can't make the stuff you need when you need it, that's not a functioning market. Like, that's not. If it turns out that like your entertainment industrial complex is so concerned about its profit share in a authoritarian government that it starts censoring what it delivers to Americans, well, it's not a free market, right? Like, so, and we know this by now over the last 5 years or so. I think that kind of language is much more commonplace than it used to be. But I think what the right needs to grapple with is that it's traditional commitments to free market capitalism, to healthy families, to strong civic institutions like local communities and faith communities and so on, so that it's not just you and the state. All of those commitments are right. They were right and they're right now, but it requires an updated economics that serves those ends, because the kind of hardcore libertarianism that we've been doing doesn't do that. So that's I think the intellectual work to be done on the right. That is happening, right? But it's by no means a done deal.
One last question on this point before we head leftward. Do you two think that there's any possible future where, as these new consensuses rise up both in the center and on the right, there is a sort of loyal opposition role for the leaders of what had previously been the Washington consensus? Do you think there's a productive role that the old Washington consensus can play from a minoritarian rather than a majoritarian position of policy world?
I mean, yeah, they're all from like your MSNBC contributor position, or to date, the way the old guard has responded is through a kind of Panglossianism, right? So like Michael Strain at AEI has a book about, you know, why everything is great in your air conditioning and refrigerator and your floor space is bigger. So it's sort of like, don't believe your lying eyes kind of reaction so far. And I think that's an understandable reaction, because in some ways there is, you know, not literally Michael Strain, but like the people who made these policy decisions have their ego attached to it in a way that is unhelpful for being objective, let's say, right? So, you know, I'm more or less a kind of free trader, right? Like, but I can still update my beliefs, seeing that the kind of deindustrialization that was induced by China entering WTO was untenable, and especially without sort of like the kind of complementary institutions you need to reinvest in those cities and towns. And historically, it's always been like, you pass the trade bill and then we'll do the job program, but then the job program never arrives, right? So I do think that we're entering a new, very slowly, unfortunately, a new paradigm where, like, you know, folks on the left, like Noah Smith, for example, like has been doing some of the best writing on like friendshoring and trying to, you know, what will take to decouple from China, and like why we should be like, you know, tightening relationships with India and Japan and all this foreign policy stuff. So I think there's a bit of a forcing function. It's forcing everybody, even some people who are more establishment, to to see that they need new ideas. The issue is that, there are a lot of like groups that will run around saying neoliberalism is over, we've entered a new paradigm, look, we passed the Chips and Science Act, so industrial policy is back, or whatever. But then you look at the details, and it's like, okay, a massive public-private partnership with like tons of tax credits and all this DEI and childcare requirements and stuff like that. Like, how different is this really? I think it's going to take more of a wake-up call. To be quite frank,
I guess that's kind of why I'm skeptical about the prospects for total shift, right? Is that because there's all those caveats
Yeah.
and everything that happens.
I'll give you a simple example. Judy Shelton. She was nominated for Board of Governors, Federal Reserve. Judy Shelton, it was striking, even like some supposed realignment conservatives were voting for her. Judy Shelton is somebody who is like as close to an Alex Jones WTO lizard person as ever existed. Like, she wanted a North American Union, she wanted to get rid of the dollar and have the Amero. Like, it's like a caricature, right? But yet she was sort of cut from that supply sider cloth, again, part of a specific governing elite that has had a degree of stickiness in DC, that even with all this rhetoric around, this was a Trump nominee, like literally the person who wants us to have a North American currency. It showed the disconnect between rhetoric and reality, right?
Well, and I mean, two things. One, I think that speaks to the reality that Trump, I think, broke open the space, the intellectual and rhetorical space to be for the right to even have these conversations, but he himself doesn't have the formula to kind of finish the job. Because there was that kind of incoherent kind of, okay, did some really great stuff on trade, but then also do
Personally,
but with the personnel as well. And then I don't know. I don't know if I'm as hopeless as saying this. I mean, because a counterpoint to that would be Lena Khan, like hashtag based Lena Khan, right? Where it's like with like Josh Hawley's strong support and others, where there are examples of quite notable shifts, even in the kind of nominee side of things, that have support from the realignment right, so to speak. So not to go like tit for tat kind of, and see what the score is, but I think there are moments where you see that things are shifting. I agree that this is kind of the beginning of a shift. It's not the end or even the middle. And everything is contingent, right? That's why I think the work that everybody does in the room and these conversations are so important. Like, it is an ongoing task that, to Sam's earlier point, like, wise leaders will either accomplish or not. That's our job, I think, to try and help them do that. But it's not a guarantee either. It's not a done deal.
Let's take it to a red-blue level now then. So what do you think are the prospects for further ongoing bipartisan cooperation on some of these questions of economic policy on the one hand, new understandings of economics and society on the other hand, for your understandings of what conservative policy should be, and their counterparts on the left, if there are any counterparts for them in the Democratic Party's coalition?
Sure. Yeah, some of these issues. So in some of these issues, there's sort of thematic convergence, but then disagreement over the details, right? So, I've done a lot of work in the child tax credit, for instance, and that's something where you've had, both, Michael Bennett and Sheriff Brown with their proposal, and eventually the Biden administration passed a massive expansion of the child tax credit in 2021. But then on the right, you have, Mitt Romney has his ideas. Josh Hawley has put forward some of his own ideas. JD Vance just recently proposed making childbirth free, like single parent for childbirth, which is pretty crazy. So there's like a ferment in that family policy space. But then when it comes down to details, one of the challenges is that these are becoming political wedge issues, right? And, you know, one of the reasons Democrats wanted to pass a big child tax credit was to say, like, we're the party of families now, right? Like, and so we have to get a little bit past like the purely like strategic game theory of it, where we're just trying to win up each other, and even some of what Biden has done. You know, it is sort of stealing some of the playbook of what like a smart Trumpism would look like, right? And that's making it much more difficult for this vision of a realignment to actually occur, because negative polarization, everyone is all of a sudden again, you know, against whatever pro-manufacturing initiative is doing or whatever. But nonetheless, I think family policy is one area of potential. Manufacturing, supply chain, basic things like that. But I really think what it's going to take is something more like severe, right? One of the disappointments I had with the pandemic was, you know, there's a famous line, "You never let crisis go to waste." And it is true, like the pandemic and stuff, you know, Congress in relatively short order passed multi-trillion-dollar stimulus packages and stuff like that. But for the most part, it was just spending more money in existing programs, like taking unemployment insurance and giving everyone an extra $600 a week, stuff like that. There was very little done on the actual structural side, decisions that would create winners and losers. And I think that's really the hammer that has yet to drop, right? Where, you know, the US has been running with these weak budget constraints for like 2 or 3 decades now, where we're able to definitely finance everything. So that means that you don't never have to make a trade-off. And at some point, we're going to have to, you know, expand one program and only do that by cutting another program. And it's a muscle that we haven't used in a long time. And it's a muscle that is particularly hard to flex in a bipartisan way, right? Because, you know, in the case of the child tax credit, like the Romney proposal would, you know, expand the child tax credit, but also cut a bunch of programs that are near and dear to progressive poverty advocates, right? And so how are you going to bring those sides together once you get down to that level of detail?
And I think, in a sense, I think it goes even a layer deeper than just we've lost kind of our muscle memory or kind of capacity to make trade-offs within government programs, or this program was that, but a kind of general abdication of policymakers in general, allowing their decisions to be made by the market, by the free market, you know, starting maybe sometime in the 70s, moving forward, where if you can just say, well, you know, the market giveth and the market taketh away, I think it lets you out of a lot of binds, lets you off a lot of hooks. And so I also think there's this broad muscle that we've also let atrophy on, just policymakers remembering that they're allowed to do their job. They're allowed to pass laws and govern in the economic space, like political economy is a thing. And rediscovering a kind of, call it Hamiltonian comfort level with that, not in contravention of traditional conservative priorities, but precisely because that's what's required to deliver those, as we talked about earlier. So I think that, and to your point about what's happening on the left, that I think you also see that, right? So smart folks on the left. I mean, you got Bernie and you got Warren, but also like don't sleep on like Chris Murphy from Connecticut. He wrote this pretty interesting piece in the Atlantic last fall about like coming out of the wreckage of neoliberalism, and he's writing about Democrats need to get comfortable with a Hamiltonian economic nationalism that we've forgotten how to do, and we need to frame it in terms of like the well-being of families. And if we don't do that, we're not doing our job. So there are people having those conversations on the left as well. I think Sam's probably right on like thematic convergence is encouraging, but it only gets you so far. To me, I think in a space like family policy, I guess the hopeful side would be, can that thematic convergence get you close enough that real like normal deal making can start to happen, where Mitt Romney and Bennett are close enough, and say they have managed to kind of consolidate their respective proposals as the Democratic and Republican options. Well, then you could actually have a real situation in which a deal is made, but you have to get close enough for that deal to become possible. Maybe some, an area in which we're further along is just China. and the need to question kind of our free trade priors on our relationship with China. Like everyone over the last little while now has a bill banning Chinese ownership of agricultural land, which is a pretty good idea. We should have done that a long time ago. Everyone's there, right? I think people are increasingly getting comfortable with the idea that we need some kind of reverse CFIUS ability to review outbound investment flows, or just like a flat ban on certain types of investment flows. Where why are we letting American companies do certain things in China? We don't have to do that. And that is rapidly, I think, approaching a bipartisan consensus. In the same way that the CHIPS Act kind of already, it's kind of problems notwithstanding, have already done that and passed with bipartisan support. So I do think it's like not an easy journey, but in some of these areas we're a lot further along than others. And if you can get close enough, you get enough convergence, then you can actually start to get some stuff done.
I appreciate that you're thinking about it that way too, actually, because one of the things that has confused me a lot about what would seem to be a huge opportunity for a certain kind of economic thinker of the post-Occupy Wall Street, Bernie Sanders to a certain kind of like new post-left, becoming at least a thing on the internet, and in some other ways a real thing in left activist circles. And then the post-Tea Party, Trumpist, nationalist, populist stuff becoming very much a thing on the internet and very much the thing in policy circles. The fact that they have fundamentally different priors about a whole bunch of cultural understandings of the person and ideas of what the good society should be, even despite having probably similar critiques of the systems that that exist, right? It seems that the whatever rhymes there are at the cultural level are further driven apart by just differences in culture that keep a lot of practical policymaking ideas still work at a very early level. And I think there was that thing where Josh Hawley and Bernie Sanders were about to make a proposal and that they didn't. You guys recall that one? So stuff like that is what seems to me to be, and then in a very, very different way. Ted Cruz and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who are not in this particular kind of framework at all, but they had some kind of money in politics proposal, if I'm thinking about this right. And then for the same standard cultural reasons, you didn't see anything about that. It just seems that at some level, culture war stuff has usually been a kill shot against actual left populists and right populists, and even left libertarian and right libertarian things from being able to convene, you know. And I think that probably says interesting things about the nature of the relationship of the cultural to the economic and structural in American politics, at least. But I don't know, I'd be curious to what you guys think about that. And in that context, there's just two more questions that I have before we are going to open it up to audience Q&A. But the first one of those is, what is your understanding of how, and I think it's been implicit over the course of this conversation so far, but what's your understanding of what the American government and leaders with new ideas in the American government what's the good society, the society of social trust, the society of the right kind of freedom and the right kind of enterprise and the right kind of individualism? What does that society look like, and how do you see the ideas that you've been working on and the ideas that you're helping push new consensuses on get there?
Yeah, gosh, there's a lot to be said on that. That's kind of the question, right? There's a lot of different ways I guess we could take this conversation. One thing I will say, and this gets to Sam's earlier point about kind of the disillusionment and rage of normal Americans feeling unheard. Well, they actually are unheard. That's true. And the good society, I think, requires a kind of enfranchisement where that's no longer true. And that doesn't mean a kind of fantasy of like Athenian direct democracy. It can be as simple as creating spaces again for like the worker voice in the workplace. You talk about the loss of faith in institutions, like that's very much true in the workplace, where the Americans have lost faith in the workplace as a site of cooperative endeavor. And it can be that, but it can only be that if workers feel like and actually do have a voice. And we can do that. We can take the kind of Aaron O'Toole example in Canada, and some of the stuff that we've worked on with Senator Rubio and Congressman Jim Banks on labor law reform, where there are all kinds of creative things that can be done to make workers feel like and actually be joint partners with management and owners of capital as like all party to the same shared enterprise. That's a pretty good place to start. If you're looking for this kind of like Aristotelian civic friendship, where we all kind of see ourselves as in it together in some sense, kind of all committed to the same political project, at least on a basic level, I don't think you can do that unless mechanisms of collective worker voice are a feature of that society's economy, which incidentally is very much Martin Luther King's point. He gave a series of speeches to organized labor in the 60s, in which he told, because organized labor was very uncertain how it felt about the civil rights movement. Part of organized labor was like fully there on the ground, helping. There's a lot of like good old boys who were not at all sure that this was the right move. And like the AFL-CIO was in all kind of consternation about it. So he went and gave a series of speeches. And what he said was like the civil rights movement and the labor movement together that can be the architects of democracy, but they have to do it together. And what he meant, at least as I understand him from having read those speeches, is that like access to the ballot box is like the necessary but not sufficient. It's like necessary but not sufficient for full enfranchisement. You need to be able to have a meaningful role in the nation's economic life, a meaningful voice in economic life, and people be treated as such by your bosses, by the people who own the businesses. And if that doesn't happen, then like the dream of democracy is not yet realized. He deployed that dream language quite frequently, even before like the I Have a Dream speech, in that context, that to realize the dream of democracy requires worker voice. So that's one place I think to start. If you want to pursue depolarization, to Sam's point about the check engine light, like give people a voice in the most practical, immediate place you can, which is where they spend all their working hours. If you do that, I think we'll make a good start. Same question, Seth?
I'm not opposed to that. So I do think there's this problem of sort of, especially for the Trump base, right? Like a lot of places, these were like former sort of blue dog labor Democrats, right? And now that labor is basically dead, right? Like there's no organizing principle, so they develop like cult of personality, basically. So there's like on a practical level, I'd much rather these people belong to clubs and work councils or whatever, and kind of places to actually channel their sort of inchoate demands into something that is more productive. So I'm not really against that. My skepticism is that there's no way from here to there, right? Like the Democratic Party is the Democratic Party is never going to do substantial labor law reform that doesn't basically just double down on the current model, because it would upset too many incumbent interest groups. And if Biden can't even be bothered to like invite Tesla to their EV rose garden ceremonies, right? Because even though Tesla has more electric vehicles on the road than the big three combined, like they're not part of the UAW, and so they don't exist, right? So I'd much rather I think there's much more risk in harming the sources of organizational confidence that we have left, right? Like our government can barely do anything. It can cut big checks and it can like do advanced market commitments and things like that. But there's a reason SpaceX builds the rockets and NASA just pays for them, versus in the old days, and that's what we built the products. And so I'm most worried about, first do no harm, right? And let's not like put all our great entrepreneurs under just consent decrees and like crush the entrepreneurial dynamism of America. That's what will save it in the end. Bigger picture, you asked what my sort of longer run vision. I do think there isn't a chance that we are sort of on the precipice of another, industrial revolution scale transformational technological transformation with artificial intelligence and just software eating the world more generally. And anytime there's been a economic transition of that magnitude, there have been accompanying institutional change, right? So like most of what we're living in today, like the current US government is, 70 years old. It sort of emerges as a New Deal where you have like this post-war and during the war sort of build up in state capacity that was it took us out of the 19th century into the 20th century. That took large congressional majorities. It took a leader like FDR, and it took it wasn't easy by any means, and there's a lot of mistakes that were made. And so my feeling is that we may be entering something like that again, where we're going to not just need to tinker on the margins and make it easier to like a work council or something like that, but like literally reopen the NLRA, the Labor Rights Act, or literally reopen the Administrative Procedures Act, and like reopen all these like basically the firmware of American government. And it'd be better to do that before it becomes like before you're forced by necessity. But that's going to require, I sort of vision in mind that like, at some point with all the miasma of AI and cyber attacks and denial of service attacks across government, and we'll go for like 5 years where the IRS doesn't collect revenue or something like that, and finally like Congress will wake up and be like, oh, we should get our shit together.
I would just like to clarify, I think Sam is right. I agree with Sam about the scale of change that would be required. At least if we're talking specifically on the labor front, it would need to be quite fundamental. Just we'll co-sign that point afterwards.
It's also,
I was just to emphasize psychologically, personality wise, I'm high in openness. I'm a classic like liberal, right? Like classic like the code, like not like the but I think all this change is, it's hard to the fundamental paradox is all the college educated technical people are Democrats. People who actually know like how unemployment insurance works, stuff like that, are Democrats. And all the people who are willing to piss off the trial lawyers and the unions and the incumbent interests are Republicans. And we need to somehow like get more college educated people in the Republican Party, because I think a lot of the structural change will only come from a party that has a more ideological base rather than the Democrats, which tend to be more of an interest group.
Or just better empower people who don't go to college.
this is something that we're going to have to mull in multiple future America's Public Forum events as well too. So I look forward to you guys on those. But you've teed up my final question really well. Which New Dealer are you? Sam and Chris, individually, which New Dealer are you?
Henry Morgenthau.
Okay. I would have. Secretary of the Treasury.
This is how you know Sam is smarter than I am. I'm not sure I understand the question.
There were many New Dealers. There were many individuals who worked for President Franklin Roosevelt on domestic policy. Which one of them are you?
Stevens?
I don't have a good answer.
Okay. Well, the next time we're on camera together, I'll ask you again. I will
You can splice it in over.
Look at that in post, it's fine.
Mine is probably Tommy Corcoran, but I'm not sure yet. I don't think I'm that smart.
Vannevar Bush.
Second. Does he really count as a New Dealer? Because he was in the national security side of things. Anyways, this is a longer conversation that we'll do a special APF on one of these days.
Who ran the Reconstruction Finance?
That was, there were a couple of them actually.
I'll be that guy.
Okay, great. Well, actually, in that case, you can be Tommy Corcoran, who wrote most of the legislation for that, and I'll be somebody else. I'll be Bob Marshall, the wilderness preservation guy. So, all right, with that, we are open to questions from the audience. Please raise your hand if you're interested in asking a question, and please, over the course of asking a question, make sure that it becomes a question, and I will vigorously ensure that. So, first question from my dear friend Aaron. Aaron, stand up and tell
There's no
everyone.
microphone, right? So just
Yeah, no microphone, just
project this way.
yes.
You talked about the firmware, opening up the firmware of American government and the way the policies are enacted and carried out. And I'm really interested in that and how a lot of college educated, you're missing the perception if you're with Republicans, a lot of college educated people think, conservative columnist and Colbert, their critique of Trump was, he just doesn't speak well, he doesn't speak conservative policies well. And so I'm just curious, could a coalition be built between Democrats and Republicans, say liberals and conservatives, so to speak, on updating the firmware of American government? Because I think my focus is in having, especially dealt with IRS recently, in terms not because I'm being investigated, but like filing taxes, and I manage a nonprofit, and we were trying to change from private foundation to public charity status, and I ended up having to figure out the nomenclature of the IRS system, and I just emailed the commissioner and surprised, and it was changed. So politics does work. So my question is again, getting government to work better. What kind of in a short time period answer, how can we get the government to work better? Because I think there could be a coalition of, again, Republicans, Democrats, government shouldn't just be like cut, Republicans. It should be as efficient as possible. I think everyone would want that and would want the IRS, the DMV, other government agencies to work efficiently and at the least cost possible. So do you have any thoughts on, again, like specific, changes to processes and procedures,
Sure.
on that?
Yeah, I have a piece in Milken Review called Rebuilding the IRS, that specifically like all about that, but the IRS is a good sort of case study and just how backward the current system is, right? So the IRS runs on something called the individual mapping file, which is like the file that contains all the tax records, and it's written in assembly language. It's like the base language of computers, and I think it was last coded like in the Kennedy administration, right? And so it's incredibly old, incredibly fragile. There was a process to try to modernize the programming language that the IRS runs on, and because of Tea Party era, I think Jason Chaffetz is actually responsible reforms. The IRS used to have a special hiring authority where they could hire software engineers at competitive salaries, and that expired. And the software engineer that was leading that modernization had his contract expire, and now he works for the Social Security Administration. So I'm sure that they have billions of dollars now to pick that project back up, but it's an example of just how we're like 50 years out of date, right? And I think one of the issues with state capacity is this sort of like diverging user experience you have between the private and the public sector, right? If you want to sign up for Medicaid, you have to be on the website at a certain time because literally there's hours that the website is active. And then there's all this identification stuff, and you'll get rejected 5 times before you get accepted. Meanwhile, you can hail an Uber and see exactly where it's coming. So there's this gap between what we know is possible from other user experiences and what the government is working like. I think the more that the public will demand this, and one of the political challenges is that it doesn't always cut in the political directions you'd expect, right? So the Democrats, to their credit, funded the IRS massively. Obviously, Republicans are so against that. They think it's like whatever 80,000 new IRS agents or whatever they're talking about. But in theory, if you had a truly modern IRS, you would need fewer IRS agents because you'd have a simpler code and there would be a lot more automated, not in a dumb way, but in a smart way. So there's a version of state capacity which just says let's beef up the public administration, and then I think there's a truer version of state capacity which is let's try to get to Estonia. And Estonia has a super efficient e-government where taxes and transfers are fully automated and electronic, and And as a consequence, they have a very small civil service, right? So that's the pitch I would make to Republicans. It's like, if you really don't like IRS agents, let's get ChatGPT in there and.
It's also a lot easier to keep the government like accountable and transparent. Under those
Right,
circumstances,
exactly.
which is also appealing to everybody across the.
Remove the discretion.
So Sam's talking about kind of the customer or user experience, so to speak, which is massively important. And I could rant for a long time about how Florida's UI system collapsed during the pandemic because of underinvestment by prior Republican governors. Like that's the
Because of intentional sabotage.
yes, well, deliberate underinvestment. So it's like, yeah, so. But I guess maybe then to jump to all the way to the other side of the situation and talk about kind of the high level structures of the federal government. If our federal government is not well designed to construct and implement like a national industrial strategy. And I think you see that even with the kind of emerging bipartisan will to do something on semiconductors, still really hard. We don't have any kind of domestic development bank or the development finance corporation. Pretty much every other like major industrialized democracy does. We should have one. That's just a standing authority to issue loans or guarantee loans or take equity stakes or give grants or whatever needs to be done. In the interest of a coherent national industrial strategy. We might need to talk about like agency reform. Maybe one person should be making like, we can, so there's all kinds of things to be discussed at kind of that structural level of the federal agency structure and so on. That I think are also important to make the government work better and more coherently in the kind of directions that I would like to see it go.
More questions, let's go to Justin, on the other side.
So there's a very practical Karl Rove quote where he says, quote as saying, you guys are what we call the reality-based community, which he defined as people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. And he says that's not the way that the world really works anymore. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while we're studying that you're studying that reality judiciously, as you will, we'll act again, creating another reality, which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. We're history's actors, and all of you, will be left to just study what we do. As we move into, will decisions moving forward, will they be done under a reality-based community system or another framework?
Also, congratulations, Justin. I don't think anybody has ever read the entire reality-based community copy pasta on America's Public Broadcasting Q&A, and you have just done it first. So, Sam, Chris, reality-based community or otherwise.
I'd take reality over whatever like postmodern imperialism that is. Is that like might makes right, but it would have helped if they had like planned for like a post-Iraq reconstruction. Like that was they didn't just like will it into existence because they sounds like Karl Rove is like the manifest journalist and stuff like that. But he's more than that.
So you can go to americancompass.org and find a piece we did within our like globalization work called Wrong All Along, which is basically just a compilation of all the massively hubristic quotes of the bipartisan consensus and how they got it so wrong on globalization and trade. And I think that at the end of the day, like, look, we're all always kind of in pursuit of the truth as best we can, and that's never a done deal. But it's also that the world just works a certain set of ways, like, and it will catch up to you if you try and live and govern contrary to how the world really works. One of those things, for example, is that like in a healthy capitalism, labor and employers are in a certain kind of relationship to each other. And if you start behaving as if that's not true, which is what globalization, also financialization, and the death of organized labor kind of all facilitated, you're going to damage your economy, which we've done. You're going to damage your social fabric, which we've done. I think it's like the truth catches up with you sooner or later, right? The bill comes due. That's true, I think, in our personal lives, right? I think it's true in national life as well. The bill comes due sooner or later, because the world and healthy capitalism specifically, they work a certain set of ways. That's how I would.
There's probably a whole interesting event to be done on questions of the role of empirical social science on policymaking and vice versa one of these days, but we will get to that sooner or later. All right, raise your hands and keep them raised so that I have a sense of how many more questions we're probably going to get through. Okay, it's helpful to know. Let's get first to Corey.
Yes, what the question you said something about earlier about the idea like a multicultural, like multi-ethnic, like working class kind of like coalition. I do wonder, like, what's your take on the fact that like in many other countries like Europe, like it doesn't seem like that would like work, for instance, like countries like Sweden or many other countries that have much more broad and much stronger safety net. United States, much stronger labor protections, things like that. That does not necessarily stop things like very intense, like anti-immigrant sentiment, for instance, where the culture wars are going on over there. It seems to be reflecting some of many of the culture wars are going on over here. It doesn't seem to me that, like, I've seen, like, I'm pretty skeptical of the idea that, like, that the materialistic of politics, in the sense of like, people across like different ethnic groups have like these very, like they have these common set of like material values, material goals that they want to see happen. And once you take care of that, everything else just like downstream from that. Do you like comment on that a bit?
Yeah, that's a huge question. I guess the way I see it is that you've got dangers on both. You're walking on a narrow path and there's like a deep cliff fall on either side. And over here is like Carl Schmitt, the Nazi philosopher, who kind of theorized that it is only possible to constitute a political community as against an enemy or a scapegoat or another, which is of course how the Nazis operated. And that I think is a temptation at all times and places. You do see that in Europe quite a lot these days, right? This kind of highly ethnic nationalism. You see that on the fringes of the American right, and this kind of white nationalism having its moment again. Not that it ever kind of went away, but this new moment. So I think that's real and dangerous. And then over here, you've got kind of the Marxist answer, which you were talking about, which is like it's all class all the time, and as long as we can like consolidate the working class as the working class, everything else is downstream from that. And that clearly doesn't quite work either. And not only does it not work, when people try and make it work, things go really bad in communist nations. So, you know, I mentioned Aristotle's theory of civic friendship earlier, which is this sense that at least at a basic level, we are all in it together. We're like travelers in the same boat. And that's where I kind of pin my hope or my aspirations, is a kind of American civic sensibility that we really are in it together. We stand or fall together. That's just true. And we can choose to do what Europe is doing, what some on the far right want to do, and kind of play that more ethnic identity game. That's not going to work, right? That has never worked at any time and place, and it's to be fought against vigorously. I think we need a sense of kind of American communal identity that supersedes that, which is easier to do. It's not easy to do, especially in like a post-religious moment where kind of some of those kind of common religious or metaphysical narratives also aren't there to be drawn on. So it's not easy, but I don't think it's impossible. And I think there's some practical places to start. Like right now, like a whole bunch of like low-income workers in the US are being exploited all the time. Like we could do something about it. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's kind of where I was going for a
couple of comments on it, that point as well. In the political science literature on like where populism comes from, there are different theories that address different sources of discontent, and there is evidence that the social insurance programs that are Scandinavia is known for do buttress populist backlash against globalization, right? And there's research conversely in the United States that countries that suffered the most from Chinese imports, or counties, saw political polarization increase thereafter. And it wasn't that they all became Trump supporters; they became Bernie supporters too, depending on what their election was. So there are systems that you need to buttress like economic, the purely materialistic forms of sources of populism. But then there's the other side, which is ethnic integration, and Denmark does really well on the economic side of things because they're a super globalized country. 1 in 5 workers change jobs every year. It's like there's constant creative destruction. But at the same time, they have this legacy of social housing, where a quarter of their housing stock is means that's the social housing. And so what happens is you have, say, a bunch of refugees get resettled. They all get sorted into these housing projects, and then natives that are in line for those housing projects get really mad. And so there's been some research done from some political scientists at American University showing that the vote for far right parties in Denmark and Austria, where they both have social housing, is like spatially correlated with how close you are to that housing. And the theory is that the more you make these conflicts between natives and immigrants salient, and you make it like very like zero sum, that's how you generate those kind of conflicts. And so I think the solution there is very different. It's not we need stronger safety nets. It's like we need social programs that don't set up these direct conflicts between natives and outsiders.
Let's go to a question from this lady with the cool shades.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your questions. How the society. I really like that. I read the history of many empires. A good society at least needs 3 things. Number 1 is strong economy. Number 2 is strong military. Number 3 is a more equal society rather than too much discrimination of the wealth and the poor. Otherwise, we're in the revolution. United States right now, we do have strong military, which is good. It's not very good due to we have a high debt, real high debt, and also the every year have deficits and keep on adding to the debt. We need to solve that problem. Another thing is that the Fed keep on printing money and available infrastructure for so long, which is a wealth transfer. That's increased the discrepancy between the wealth and the poor, which is not stable for the society. We need to solve that problem too. So how are we going to solve that problem? Thank you.
I will just validate the point and agree with it and say, if I can pitch our work again, on our website, we've got a guide to inequality, which is just a data research project showing how much worse inequality has gotten in America over the last few decades, as kind of working people's wages have stayed relatively stagnant and the upper crust kind of accumulates more and more of the nation's wealth. Like, it's a massive problem, and it's on that list of things that traditionally economic conservatives aren't supposed to talk about or aren't supposed to care about, and that's a massive mistake. To the extent that conservatives don't address that, like they're gonna keep having problems. So I agree with you that it's a huge issue, and the trend lines also are part of the problem. It's not just like the gap; it's that the gap is widening over time, and that people care about their relative status as well as their absolute status. Like the AEI guys would say, "Hey, well, everyone has enough to eat, and we're all doing fine." So, well, no, we're not doing fine. That kind of social fabric starts to rip the wider that gap gets. So I agree with you. It's an issue.
I would just say that America has a lot of problems, but its economy. There are a few other countries that are better positioned than the United States to lead this century in technology. And so, there are many problems. I would almost even bracket the kind of like development of like an underclass and the opiate epidemic and things like that. Those are sort of economic issues at root. but there are also broader sort of social pathologies that require more complex interventions. In terms of like the overall broader economy, I'd much rather be in America than in Europe or China, right? And so maybe it has its problems, but everyone else has bigger problems.
This will be a really interesting continuing conversation too. Let's go to more questions real quick. Ben in the front, did you want to ask?
I'm just wondering, when you were talking about, but kind of, there's this whole working class and neither party to pay any attention to them. So many of our elected representatives have no incentive to pay any attention to their constituents. They're in safe districts, the districts be very matters that they're gonna lose. What are we gonna do to get that to change? Because I feel like that, I mean, that's, to me, it's just a gargantuan problem. That they don't care about those people, even if they're their constituents.
I guess I'm gonna say two things. One is that is often true, it's not always true. There are plenty of members of Congress who do care about their constituents and try and be responsive to them.
Not enough.
So, yeah, for you, I always want more, but, and there are other members of Congress that at the very least understand their own political incentives. But they do need to be responsive, at least on some levels. They want to keep their job. But yeah, there are all kinds of things we could do. I mean, we probably should have a whole other separate conversation about how we do campaigns in this country, and how we pay for them, and whether that should be the case. Like whether or not Citizens United was like a good idea or not, we should have that conversation. So I think there are probably all kinds of structural things one could do, or at least have a debate about. Yeah, that's a whole nother hour's worth of conversation.
I would just add as okay, go ahead.
No, I have another very quick question.
Oh, just that, you know, even with gerrymandering and things like that, it doesn't really matter if you're a congressperson, like has an open line of communication with your constituents, if they're not allowed to put things on the floor to be voted on, and if they're only voting on like big omnibus bills every now and then. So I think that's actually like a core issue that is almost prerequisite to like any kind of like reinvigoration of competitive districts, because it doesn't matter if they're competitive, they all have to fall in line with the party at the end.
Ask your follow-up, and then I'm going to start stacking questions so that we can get as many.
Okay, I'm fascinated by this idea of giving labor a voice outside of unions. I don't think unions are that good, but how, in a very practical way, like, what does that look like?
Okay, and hold that, and I'll get two more questions, then you guys can respond to us. More questions, Len.
Well, kind of piggybacking on her first question, you know, what do you think of as a way to get new people in, you as representatives of all different structural ideas that are being put out, like proportional representation, ranked choice voting, top 5, or third party is another way to get new people in. You expressed, especially Chris, I think, the need to have different new people in representation and, you know, in government.
And then let's take a third question. Let's take a third question from you, Lindsay.
So I apologize, I'm not a policy person, so this is a normie question, but it's multiple choice, so I'll spare you.
We all forgive you.
Okay. So is politics downstream from culture? Is culture downstream from politics? Or C, does it not matter?
That's not a normie question.
Oh.
That's one of the best questions. Okay, you guys can answer whichever of those three.
He can take the last
It's
question.
multiple choice, it's an easy one.
Pardon me, remind me of your question, sorry.
Well,
About
structural
PR.
changes to get new people in the government.
Yeah, I'm open to experimentation with like ranked choice voting and things like this. I think my big problem with it is it sort of, those proposals tend to fall into the bucket of this one weird trick will fix American government. And it's not that they're not worth, they're experiments worth trying, but I think to me, the core structural things in the reforming are like the legislative filibuster, right? Like I would, and that would be, you know, to remove the veto points to actual change, right? And that would be like disruptive because, you know, one Congress will have Medicare for all, and the next Congress will have a purely free market healthcare system, and we'll go back and forth until that eventually we'll have like some equilibrium. But I think that's that's what's really missing is we have to break down some of these veto points. And one of the ways we do that is by encouraging more factionalization within Congress, right? And so my colleague Steve Tellis has done a lot of writing on this under the title of The Futurist Faction, where he's pointed out that the American system of government, to the kind of Madisonian point, is sort of designed not with parties in mind. It's designed to have real factions, and throughout most of the 20th century, even though we had two parties, we sort of had four parties, right? There were conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans and so forth, and a lot of overlap. We're living in this like 20-year period of like consolidated party leadership, where Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy are kind of like the prime minister, right? And they're whipping their votes, but the Congress isn't set up to work that way, right? And so in some ways, like the stuff the Freedom Caucus got, the concessions they won from McCarthy, like I think that even if they're not the way I would do it, it's like wresting more power from leadership is a positive development, because it means once you get your member elected, they're able to actually make odd bedfellow coalitions and find the areas of overlap that are currently being suppressed because of this kind of parliamentary style.
Well, and on that note, it's been fascinating to see just how broad the endorsement of the idea of a floor fight over the Speaker of the House has been. I've heard it from everybody from Yuval Levin to people who I'm scared to tell people that I follow on the internet. Like this. He goes by the name Maoist Trumpist Token Senpai in some of our but the fact that everybody across the whole right into a significant part of the left of the aisle saw what happened on that particular issue, the notion that the Speaker of the House should not be something that's automatically done as a shoo-in, but no, we should have competition and refactionalization over how we choose our leadership, because those are the kinds of conventions that gave us Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt in a presidential setting many years ago, right? I think that's the closest thing to make me believe that you guys are right and that there is a change forthcoming in the nature of American government, but that's not here.
I don't want to forget your question about labor policy either. So that's a really long conversation, and we could happily have it at length offline, but really quickly, there's a couple things I think that can be done. One is to increase the value proposition of belonging to like a worker-led organization or a union. There are a bunch of countries mostly in Northern Europe, and Europe is functionally right to work because of that legal system, but the union density is super high. Because the value of being a member of one of these organizations is so high, it's so attractive. And in the US, there's such a increasingly limited scope of what a union can even do for you, partly because the regulatory state has kind of taken over more. Like we already did, we got the weekend. We did that. We don't think that should be right. A lot of employment law, I think, kind of encroaches on what a union might have previously negotiated. And part of the reason why these European countries have such high density is what they call the Ghent system, which is where the government kind of devolves administrative power to a worker-led organization to deliver and administer benefits. So like healthcare, which some unions do, but like and training, which some unions in the US also do, but like even UI, even unemployment insurance, where this organization can be in receipt of public money, of members' own contributions from the employer, and then be the one responsible for administering that. It makes it way more accountable, right? Nobody votes for governor because of how the state UI system performs. Those bureaucrats are functionally accountable to no one, certainly not the voters. But if you get to elect to join an organization that's delivering your benefits, and if they do a bad job, you can leave and join another one, and that person will be legally responsible for the outcome. Like it works pretty well. So you can,
Almost strengthening you.
yeah, exactly, to do more in a way that should be attractive to all stripes, because the more an organization like that is empowered to do, the less the state has to do. So if you're a small government conservative, that's attractive. The more that a union is empowered to negotiate, the less the regulatory state has to do, which should also be appealing to a small, government conservative. So that's one idea. We polled like would you support that if, especially because this organization being receipt of public funds, you couldn't spend on politics, like a 501c3 can't spend on politics because it enjoys public tax benefits. If you did that, that's the deal. Unions get to do this, they can't spend on politics. It's like 3-1 in favor. It's a very winning idea. So there's that, there's a whole conversation to be had about sectoral bargaining. Like Sam mentioned, just scrap the NLRA structure entirely and have these negotiations at the sectoral or industry level, which makes the individual workplaces a much more peaceable place, because that's not the level at which that fight is having. It also means all these workplaces don't have to race to the bottom on wages by squeezing their unions or union busting or squeezing their workers, because that floor is set above the, at a different level. Co-determination, putting workers on corporate boards is an important idea. And then also, and this really pisses off folks on the left, but giving workers more options of like non-adversarial forums. So it's technically illegal to have like a German style works council under the NLRA because it's seen as like a company influenced union. But there's a lot of value in having a non-adversarial forum for labor and management to talk things out. So there's a whole suite of policy options, all of which have merit that I think all of which will contribute a lot.
For what it's worth, Chris, the New Dealer you could look at as for sectoral bargaining purposes would be huge on us. Right, so noted. Yes. Let's take another bundle of questions from people who you guys both know. And I'm going to call on them because I know they have things that have probably been churning for years. And I'm sure this has happened. So Gabriella, do you happen to have any questions that you want to ask?
I think there's been great so far. I know there's a lot of discussion about the policy and employment. What I wanted to ask is that, there's a lot of rhetoric on both sides about sort of effective implementation of employment, sort of conflicting values entirely. Employment, one side says buy American is great, that's what the money is for. The other is sort of trying to prioritize all these social programs, like, mandating healthcare on a construction site, which is not practice. So in your guys' view, is there some sort obviously there's a tension between the same people for different needs. Do you see that sort of tension being resolved in future pieces of legislation, or is that sort of an issue that has to be resolved for productive work can actually happen in that space? There's no sense allocating billions if people want to spend it differently and then it's just going again.
So there's one big bundle. Thank you, Gabriella. Second, Avery, do you have any questions you'd like to ask at this point?
Yeah, I was going to ask, you guys talked about a lot of policies, and I want you to compare the record of from 2017 to 2020 versus Biden 2021 to now. Bonus hard mode, cannot mention Operation Warp Speed, and I'm curious how it informs your vote.
Thank you, Avery. And third for the bundle, Emma. Whose fault it is that this event happened, actually, but.
Yeah, so I think there's a question that Chris, you alluded to a little bit, is going back to the role of religion in restoring the economic consensus. Because it seems that the decline in religion and religious participation is something that we can't overlook in these discussions, especially when it comes to getting sort of unified answer around these issues. So I was wondering if you could speak more to that side of things as well.
So those are three questions. You guys can take whichever of them you like, or all three of them a piece, whichever you prefer.
Three easy questions. All right. Nice.
On the industrial policy question, there's a reason why America has mostly done, like most of American industrial policy historically, at least in modern history, has been through the Defense Department. And that's because it's the one part of government where there's enough unanimity to invest a ton of trust to have like a DARPA that can, you give program managers carte blanche with millions of dollars to go like design gene therapies or something, like some other crazy technologies, drone swarms and stuff. That's a function of our system of government, which is very, open access. Congress is hundreds of people who all have their own interests. It's very hard to herd those cats, but if it's for military and national security purposes, you can get much more coherence. My concern with a lot of the new industrial policy stuff is it's missing, going back to my very earlier comment about liberalism was a strong state, like the ability to say who's actually the boss here and who's walking the dog. It's one thing if we were like, we need a bunch of semiconductors, we're going to build a bunch of semiconductors. It's a different thing if you have like the Semiconductor Industry Association that like lobbies the Congress and says, oh my God, that like this is a crisis, and convinces some representatives to make it a crisis, and then they're the ones getting all the subsidies, An example of this that I often mention, it was when we were in the middle of the supply chain crisis, and there were cargo ships that were docked off of the LA port. And that it just so happened that summer was the LA port dock workers union contract was up for negotiation. And you had all this ferment on the left about like Biden is like reinventing industrial policy and stuff like that. But if Biden were like really into industrial policy, like Korea in the 80s, like he would have fired all those dock workers and like built a fully automated port like they have in Singapore and Korea, right? Like those jobs have already been automated. We just haven't made the decision to build those ports, and maybe get like the Boring Company guys to build some tunnels from LA to Nevada or something to actually think big and go crazy. What that would require is pissing off certain constituencies, right? And that's been the hard line. Even in defense, it's become a challenge to go against like the major primes and stuff like that. Which you know a lot about. Chris?
Yeah, on the religion question, it's a huge question. I think for me, this is my own view. There's a way in which, take Christianity, for example, which is the tradition I come out of, right? That's not a universally shared commitment, in the country. It won't ever be. But there are basic kind of precepts that I think undergird sound economic policy that I think are widely shared, that religious traditions speak to. So, for example, if you believe that the human person is endowed with an infinite value and worth, well, you can only do economics a certain set of ways, and you can't do economics a certain other set of ways if that's your starting premise. And I think underneath a lot of the kind of economic work that, at least work that I do, is that belief in the dignity of the human person and all the implications that come out of that, the dignity and centrality of healthy families, of local communities, and so on, are all kind of, for me anyway, premised in a like axiomatic belief in the dignity of human persons. So, and I think the Catholic social teaching tradition is a really good example of how to, that community has thought through the implications of that basic belief for economics, which is like, all right, like Marxist totalitarianism doesn't work, like kind of ethnic nationalism doesn't work, laissez-faire unfettered capitalism doesn't work, like, and it's thought through what it should look like to have a free society that organizes economics for the common good. Not saying they're right about everything, but there's a lot of richness there in articulating like the value of worker organization, for example, and so on. So in my mind, there are these, I think if you asked most Americans, do you believe that people have dignity and value inherently? They would say yes. And that is a kind of theological commitment, regardless of how that person would like identify religiously. So that's where I look when it comes to that question. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I think about it.
A very quick follow-up, and this will be the last question before we go to final statements here.
So for the follow-up, do you think the rise in the national conservatism movement that tends to prioritize the Protestant revival in the United States, or the rise in Catholic integralism and other movements took place in response to or coming out of sort of the Trump jackhammer effect of 2016? Do you think that they would have occurred without this economic and political realignment that we're seeing, or what do you think the relationship is between the two?
Yeah, that's a whole nother session all by itself as well. What the nature and meaning of that kind of movement is. I guess And again, this is just me, I would kind of caution against missing the forest for the trees. It's like a Protestant integralist state will not be forthcoming. That's just not, that's not what we currently have. Well, that's not like
In a Catholic.
yeah, that's just not gonna happen. What can happen is a kind of rootedness in these basic precepts about the value of the human person and letting that guide national policy. And I think religious communities have a lot and a kind of critical and indispensable role in making that happen. But yeah, those who are waiting for like Adrian Vermeule to take over the world, that's just, it's not the way.
It does seem though that if we've resolved anything here tonight, it is that we should get rid of our present regime and replace it with a Canadian workers and aristocracy. Specifically by a triumvirate of YouTube. The rest of us can help with it in some ways.
Loyalists, restorationists. Is my project.
Let's you two can both take a minute or so for some final remarks, and then we'll go ahead and get started on it. I've enjoyed this conversation a lot. By the way,
I'm not sure what's left to be said. What would you like us to talk about?
I can comment on just on Emma's question about like Protestant revival or something like that. I do think there is this perennial idea in conservatism that what we need is a kind of one nation conservative, sort of Israeli style reawakening. And my issue with that is that we had a Great Awakening. It was called the Great Awakening, right? And that in some ways was a Protestant revival movement, right? And the conservatives that want for that long for that one nation conservatism rooted in some like mainline tradition are have to reckon with the fact that it happened and and they don't like it. and for good reason, because I'm not particularly religious, so I don't really have any horse in this race, but what I really am is a pluralist, and I think that is the way forward in a country as ideologically and culturally diverse as the United States. And one of the functions of pluralism should be to call out both the Catholic integralists and their sort of asinine project that doesn't really have any social base or any real support outside of like some Notre Dame students, but also to call out the woke stuff, not because we're some red pill Jordan Peterson person, but because it itself is also a kind of religious sectarian movement that is, and really we need to have a kind of act of toleration, a kind of peace between our low-grade religious warfare if we're going to get to the real issues.
let me reframe this question. Take 30 seconds, please. What gives you hope when you look around the desiccated wasteland of a landscape of the American economy of 2023? What gives you hope for everything that you've said today?
I think there's like we're kind of in like the aftermath of an earthquake, right? Where a lot of damage has been done, but also the foundations that were weak to begin with have been rebuilt. So I think one thing that gives me hope is that we probably have a clearer idea, at least on the economic policy front, of some of the things we need to be doing that we didn't have 10 years ago. And that's emerging. I think that's good. That gives, at the very least, that is an opportunity for action that can be taken. And I think the other thing it gives me hope is just how many people genuinely want to help, want to do the right thing on this stuff. Both within this kind of conservative realignment, there's an enormous amount of energy, especially among younger people who see it and they get it and they want it to happen. And there are versions of that on the left and in the middle as well. And I think that's a hopeful sign. Like I said earlier, it's all contingent, right? We don't know the outcome, but the opportunity is there. There is energy, and now you gotta do the work.
For me, I get hope from the early signs that technology is finally coming back and that we're breaking out of the great stagnation, right? So, the last 40 years of relative stagnation technologically outside of like the internet or whatever, is what enabled a degree of like cronyism. Because if things aren't growing 3% a year, you will try to nail down what you currently have. And you also don't get the new churn, the new company formation, the new modes of production that will disrupt the existing incumbents and on its own create new coalitions. So if we can get back to like robust technological change and robust economic growth, obviously that has tons of intrinsic benefits, but the other thing it does is it destabilizes the existing set power centers in American society and opens up the possibility for new coalitions to emerge.
Well, thank you to both for what you do, and thank you to both for having joined me tonight for this America's Public Forum event. If everybody can join me in giving a round of applause. Just a couple of very quick announcements on forthcoming Braver Angels things going on. The America's Public Forum program and the Braver Angels DC project remains committed and will be committed as long as I work on it to seek out interesting conversations among interesting people from every corner of the political spectrum and whenever we can across those corners as well. This tonight is just the first of at least 4 events I'm doing this spring on the topic of political economies and social visions around the American political compass. Expect another one of these in about a month from now in early April on emerging political economies and social visions on the left, featuring my friends Pete Davis of the Democracy Policy Network and Shadi Hamid of Wisdom of Crowds. And future speakers on those lines to be announced. The America's Public Forum program doesn't only do these. We also do things on everything relating from interfaith and religious questions and polarization, something we'll be doing on March 30th later this month, to questions of historical interpretations of American identity. And there should be an APF by about July timeframe on that frame as well. Additionally, the Braver Angels DC Alliance, our grassroots volunteers around here, of whom there are several around here too, do another speaker series as well. And Lindsay and Aaron here are putting on one on March 28th, Scaling Mount Polarization at the Tenley Friendship Library. So if you follow the Braver Angels newsletter here in DC, you should already have heard about that. If not, come find us towards the end of this evening and we can make sure that you're on that so you can hear more about these sorts of events that we're doing. And we don't just do speaker forums. We also do a whole bunch of workshops. Again, family therapy style. We do a particular kind of parliamentary debate, and we've been doing those both openly with our grassroots folks and in a few cases, closed doors with young professionals who prefer not to be heard publicly or on the record for fear of their jobs, which I suppose makes sense. We are continually trying to find new ways to bring the good faith and introspective and magnanimous work that we have found works in our grassroots communities here into the heart of the nation's capital, among the folks who make the policy clocks tick and who help serve their country in ways where they use their personalities and their minds and all of their sweat. So if you have ideas or if you're interested in getting involved in that project, I am the director of the Braver Angels DC project here in Policy World. I'm more than happy to talk with you about some of those things that you can do, and I'm also more than happy to direct you around to other folks in the Braver Angels DC community who can help you find ways to do that too. Additionally, Sam and Chris, I hereby personally invite you to, if you are so interested, to the Braver Angels National Convention in Gettysburg this coming July. I would love to see you there, or I would love to see anybody who you think would be an interesting representative of the work that you guys do there, should you not be able to make it. But that invitation is outstanding. And anybody interested in that convention, come talk to me afterwards. I'm more than happy to help with that. So let me think, is there anything else that we should say here? Well, I guess the last thing is that this event in some ways emerged out of a little conversation that Emma Waters over here roped me into, despite me not knowing anything about policy. I think she is as responsible for the fact that it's happened as anybody else in this room is. So Emma, thank you for having. I guess the only last thing I'll say is that as we move forward into this uncertain future with all kinds of fascinating potentials for great creativity and great new consensuses and new coalitions. Braver Angels stands for one thing above all, and that is the notion that whatever the politics winds up being, whatever the policy winds up being, whatever those consensuses wind up being, there is a fundamental way we ought to treat each other as fellow Americans, without which there can be no nationhood, there can be no union, and there can be no political community. And we have found a couple particular practices that help bring out our own better angels. And all we try to do in all the work of our organization is help Americans in every different background, every different profession, and every different community bring out those better angels themselves. And among the policy and intellectual community, I think we have found one of those ways, and I will look forward to exploring it with friends in good faith over time, and finding ways to help you all explore them should you be interested as well. So, but thank you everybody for helping kick off the Braver Angels DC Projects programming for 2023. I look forward to seeing you at many more events, and I will see you there sometime soon. Happy cherry blossoms.